The 12 Suspects of Christmas. Chapter 1. The Snowfall Before. The first snow of December had settled upon St. Mary Mead, with the gentle insistence of a whispered secret, transforming the village into something from a Victorian Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple stood at her sitting-room window, observing the transformation with the quiet pleasure of one who had witnessed 68 such winters, each one teaching her something new about human nature, whilst appearing to repeat itself endlessly. "More tea, Miss Marple?" her companion, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, asked from her position beside the fire. Dolly had arrived that morning with news of the gathering at Greenways Manor, and had scarcely drawn breath since. "Thank you, dear. That would be most pleasant," Miss Marple replied, turning from the window. Her keen blue eyes, which younger persons sometimes mistook for vague, settled upon her friend with mild amusement. "You were saying about Colonel Fortescue's invitation? Oh, Jane, it's to be quite the affair." Dolly leaned forward, her face flushed with excitement and the warmth of the fire. 12 guests for the 12 days of Christmas. Well, the first night of them at any rate. Christmas Eve dinner at Greenways. The Colonel's determined to revive the old traditions now that he's finally settled into the manor properly. His nephew arrived from London last week to help with arrangements. Miss Marple resumed her seat and took up her knitting, a particularly intricate pattern for a christening shawl. Her needles moved with methodical precision. How very ambitious. The manor has been quite empty since old Mrs. Fortescue passed, hasn't it? 3 years now. Nearly 4, Dolly corrected. The Colonel only inherited last spring when that business with the will was finally settled. There was some dispute with a cousin in Australia, you remember? Yes, I recall. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. The cousin who contested the will was Mrs. Fortescue's niece, I believe, Margaret something. She felt she had a stronger claim than a nephew by marriage. Margaret Fenwick. Yes. Well, she's to be there too. The Colonel's invited her as a gesture of reconciliation. Very Christian of him, considering how unpleasant she made things during probate. Dolly paused to sip her tea. Though between you and me, Jane, I suspect he's being advised by that solicitor of his, Mr. Grayson. Wouldn't do to have family feuds hanging over one's first proper Christmas as master of the manor. Miss Marple said nothing, but her expression suggested she found this observation quite perceptive. She had noticed in her long experience of village life that gestures of reconciliation often concealed as much as they revealed. The greengrocer's daughter who had made peace with her stepmother, just before the stepmother's convenient accident with the stairs. The churchwarden who had embraced his business partner weeks before the embezzlement came to light. Human nature, Miss Marple had learned, could be remarkably consistent in its inconsistency. "And who else is to attend?" she inquired gently. Dolly required no further encouragement. "Well, there's the nephew I mentioned. Adrian Fortescue, very modern young man, something in advertising in London, unmarried, but he's bringing his secretary, a Miss Winters. The Colonel's daughter Celia and her husband George Prentice are coming up from Surrey. George does something frightfully important in insurance. Then there's Dr. Pettigrew and his wife. You know the Pettigrews, Jane. They moved into the old Blackwell cottage last autumn. The doctor who replaced Dr. Haydock temporarily when he was ill," Miss Marple confirmed. "A rather intense young man, I thought. His wife is much younger, at least 15 years, and terribly pretty. One of those delicate, nervous types." Dolly lowered her voice conspiratorially. "There's been talk, you know. Mrs. Pettigrew was seen having tea with Adrian Fortescue at the Rose and Crown more than once before the nephew returned to London. Of course, it may have been perfectly innocent." Miss Marple's needles never paused, but her eyes held a thoughtful gleam. In her experience, when people insisted something might be perfectly innocent, it very rarely was, not necessarily guilty of anything criminal, of course, but innocent. No, human beings were rarely that. "Do go on, dear," she murmured. "Let me see." The Colonel's invited his old army friend, Major Wentworth, dreadfully boring man, always going on about the war. And Wentworth's bringing his sister, Miss Harriet Wentworth, who's something of a blue stocking, writes books about medieval history, or some such thing. Then there's the vicar, naturally, and Mrs. Clement. The Colonel felt he ought to include them, though I don't think Mrs. Clement is terribly pleased about it. She mentioned something about Christmas preparations. "That makes 11, Miss Marple observed. "You said 12 guests." "Oh, yes. And you, Jane. That's why I've come, actually. The Colonel asked me particularly to extend the invitation. He said it wouldn't be a proper St. Mary Mead gathering without Miss Marple present. You will come, won't you?" Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded her friend with gentle surprise. "How very kind of Colonel Fortescue. Yes, I should be delighted to attend, though I confess I'm not quite sure what I could contribute to such a distinguished gathering. Nonsense, Jane. Everyone knows you're the cleverest person in the village, even if you do hide it behind your knitting and your talk of gardens. Dolly smiled warmly. Besides, I suspect the Colonel hopes you might help smooth things over if the atmosphere becomes strained. You know how people can be when old grievances are present. This was perceptive of Dolly, Miss Marple thought, and probably quite accurate. Colonel Fortescue was a careful man, not imaginative, precisely, but careful. He would have considered the various tensions among his guests, and thought it wise to include someone known for tact and observation, rather like including a fire extinguisher at a bonfire party. When is this gathering to take place? She asked. Christmas Eve, 5 days from now. Drinks at 7, dinner at 8. And Jane, Dolly hesitated, her cheerful expression clouding slightly. I hope I'm being silly, but there's something about the whole affair that feels, I don't know, forced, somehow, as though the Colonel is trying very hard to make something happen that perhaps shouldn't. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her expression thoughtful. Forced goodwill is like forced rhubarb, my dear. It may bloom earlier than natural, but it often has a bitter taste. Still, one must hope for the best. Christmas is a season of reconciliation after all. Yes, of course, Dolly said, brightening. I'm sure it will be lovely. The manor is looking quite splendid. I passed by yesterday. They've had evergreens brought in, and there are candles in every window. It will be like something from Dickens. After Dolly departed, Miss Marple remained at her window as dusk settled over the snow-covered gardens. The street lamp at the corner had just been lit, casting a warm glow across the white blanketed lane. She could see the church spire rising against the darkening sky, and beyond it, just visible through the bare trees, the chimneys of Greenways Manor. 12 guests for Christmas. 12 suspects, her rather whimsical mind amended, though suspects of what, she couldn't say. It was simply that the configuration of the gathering troubled her in some indefinable way. The reconciled cousin, the too young wife, the nephew from London with his secretary, the old grievances and new alliances, all gathered together in a manner that had stood empty through 3 winters of dispute and settlement. She thought of her nephew Raymond, who wrote detective stories, and was always amused by her village parallels as he called them. But it was true that human nature repeated itself with remarkable consistency. The young wife who took tea with a gentleman not her husband reminded her of Bella Carter, the postmaster's wife, who had done the same thing 20 years ago, that had ended with arsenic in the evening cocoa, though whether by her hand or her husband's had never been quite established. And the forced reconciliation between the Colonel and his cousin Margaret Fenwick, that reminded her of the Fletcher sisters, who had made peace after years of feud over their mother's jewellery, only for the younger sister to be found at the bottom of the stairs 3 days later. An accident, the inquest had said, but Miss Marple had never been quite convinced. I'm being fanciful, she said aloud to the empty room, her voice brisk. Christmas gatherings bring out tensions in the best of families, and there's no reason to suppose this one will be any different. Yet as she prepared her simple supper that evening, a bit of cold chicken and some bread and butter, with a small mince pie for festiveness, she found her thoughts returning to Greenways Manor. She had visited there once or twice in old Mrs. Fortescue's day. It was a handsome house, Georgian in style with high-ceilinged rooms and long windows, overlooking extensive grounds. The kind of house where voices carried and doors didn't quite close properly, where one could hear footsteps in the corridor above and conversations from the room next door, if one happened to be listening. The kind of house, in fact, where secrets would be very difficult to keep. Miss Marple finished her supper and washed up the few dishes with her usual methodical care. Then she returned to her sitting room and took up her knitting once more. The christening shawl was coming along nicely. She would have it finished well before young Mrs. Hartnell's baby arrived in February. As her needles clicked in the quiet room, she allowed her mind to wander over what Dolly had told her. 12 guests, all with their various connections and complications. The Colonel himself, playing host and peacemaker, his nephew Adrian, modern and ambitious, with a secretary in tow, the dispossessed cousin Margaret, invited back into the fold, the daughter Celia and her insurance man husband, the pretty young Mrs. Pettigrew and her intense husband, the boring Major and his intellectual sister, the vicar and his wife, and herself, of course. The 12th guest, the observer, the old lady with her knitting who noticed things. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the lamplight. Christmas was coming to St. Mary Mead, with all its bright promises of peace and goodwill, Miss Marple hoped very much that nothing would occur to disturb those promises. But hope, as she had learned over many years, was not quite the same thing as expectation, and expectation, in matters of human nature, was often the more reliable guide. She would go to Colonel Fortescue's Christmas gathering. She would be pleasant and tactful, and observe everything while appearing to observe nothing. She would knit and chat and blend into the background as elderly ladies were expected to do, and perhaps, though she hoped not, she would see something that others missed. Some small gesture or word or look that revealed the pattern beneath the surface, because patterns, Miss Marple had learned, always revealed themselves eventually. One simply had to know how to watch for them. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 9. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and prepared for bed, her movements unhurried and precise. Tomorrow she would select an appropriate dress for the gathering, and perhaps have a word with her young gardener about clearing the path. The snow showed no sign of stopping, and she would need safe passage to and from the manor on Christmas Eve. As she drew her bedroom curtains against the winter night, she paused to look once more toward the dark bulk of Greenways Manor in the distance. 12 guests for Christmas, gathered under one roof. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, she murmured to herself. Or nothing, but probably something. And with that cheerful thought, Miss Jane Marple retired to bed, leaving the snow to continue its silent work of covering St. Mary Mead in its deceptive blanket of innocent white. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. Christmas Eve dawned grey and still, the snow from the previous days lying thick and pristine across St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose at her usual hour, performed her morning ablutions with characteristic efficiency, and selected her second-best black silk dress, appropriate for evening wear without being ostentatious. The velvet trim at the collar and cuffs gave it a suitably festive air. By mid-afternoon, as the winter dusk began its early descent, she was ready. Her young gardener, Fred, had indeed cleared the path, and had been prevailed upon to drive her to Greenways Manor in his small motor car, normally used for transporting garden supplies, but cleaned and made respectable for the occasion. "Right kind of you, Fred," Miss Marple said, as they navigated the snowy lane, her gloved hands folded over her black handbag. "I confess I'm not as steady on ice as I once was." "No trouble at all, Miss Marple," Fred replied, concentrating on his driving. "Should be quite the do, from what I hear. Mrs. Beale, what does the Colonel's cooking has been in a right state all week, ordering this and that from London." Miss Marple filed this information away. Mrs. Beale was the village's most accomplished cook, but also its most irascible. Having her in a state suggested either exceptional pressure or exceptional disorganization, neither of which boded well for domestic harmony. Greenways Manor rose before them, its windows blazing with light against the gathering darkness. Candles flickered in each window, just as Dolly had described, and wreaths of holly hung on both the main door and the entrance to the servants' quarters. It looked, Miss Marple thought, exactly as a proper English manor should look on Christmas Eve, warm, welcoming, and entirely respectable. Yet as Fred helped her from the motor car, and she made her way up the swept steps to the entrance, Miss Marple was conscious of that same indefinable unease she had felt 5 days earlier. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that reconciliations and celebrations could mask as much as they revealed, or perhaps it was something else. Some instinct developed over decades of observing human nature in all its variety. The door was opened by Parsons, the Colonel's man, who had been persuaded to come out of semi-retirement for the occasion. "Miss Marple, how delightful. The Colonel will be most pleased. May I take your coat?" The entrance hall was magnificent in its Christmas finery. Evergreen garlands wound up the staircase, and a large tree stood in the corner, decorated with candles that would be lit after dinner. The scent of pine and wood smoke mingled with something else, something sharp and floral that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. She was shown into the drawing room, where several guests had already assembled. Colonel Fortescue himself came forward immediately, a tall, spare man with a military bearing that 50 years of civilian life had not entirely erased. "Miss Marple, how very good of you to come. Dolly Bantry is here already, of course, and may I present my nephew Adrian." He gestured to a sleek young man in an immaculately cut dinner jacket, who had been standing by the fireplace. Adrian Fortescue was perhaps 35, with the kind of polished charm that came from extensive practice. His handshake was firm but not crushing, his smile calculated to convey warmth without intimacy. "Miss Marple, Uncle has told me all about you, the village's most distinguished resident, he says." "How very kind, though quite inaccurate," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "I'm simply one of the oldest, which isn't quite the same thing." And this is Miss Winters, my secretary." Adrian indicated a young woman who had been sitting quietly in a corner chair, almost unnoticed until that moment. Miss Winters rose and came forward. She was perhaps 28, dressed in a simple but well-cut evening dress of dark blue that suggested good taste and limited means. Her face was intelligent but guarded, her handshake brief. "How do you do, Miss Marple?" There was something familiar about Miss Winters, though Miss Marple couldn't immediately place it. The shape of her face, perhaps, or the way she held herself, very straight, as though conscious of scrutiny. Miss Marple filed the impression away for later consideration. "And here are the Pettigrews," Colonel Fortescue continued as a couple entered from the hall. "Dr. Pettigrew, Mrs. Pettigrew, may I present Miss Marple?" Dr. Richard Pettigrew was indeed an intense young man, dark-haired and rather too thin, with the kind of burning gaze that suggested either genius or neurasthenia. His wife, by contrast, seemed almost insubstantial, a pretty blonde creature in pale pink who looked as though a strong wind might carry her away. "Such a pleasure," Mrs. Pettigrew murmured, her voice barely audible. She clung to her husband's arm in a manner that suggested either devotion or dependence, or perhaps, Miss Marple thought, both. "My dear Miss Marple, how lovely to see you." Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, swept into the room with her usual energy, the vicar trailing behind with his characteristic vague expression. "What a splendid tree. Colonel, you've outdone yourself." The room began to fill. Major Wentworth arrived, exactly as boring as Dolly had suggested, a red-faced man with tremendous mustaches, who immediately began holding forth about supply chains in the Boer War. His sister Harriet was his opposite in every way, thin, grey, and angular, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a rather alarming directness of speech. "I don't hold with all this Christmas nonsense," Miss Wentworth announced to the room at large, accepting a glass of sherry from Parsons. "Pagan festival dressed up in Christian clothes. The early church fathers would have been appalled." "Now, Harriet," her brother rumbled, "no need to be controversial." "Why not? Controversy's the only thing that makes these gatherings bearable." Miss Marple, observing this exchange from her position near the fire, noted that Miss Winters had smiled, just briefly but unmistakably, so the secretary appreciated intellectual provocation. Interesting. The arrival of Celia and George Prentice created a small stir. Celia Fortescue, now Prentice, was a handsome woman of about 40, dressed in expensive but slightly outdated evening wear. She kissed her father's cheek with what appeared to be genuine affection, then surveyed the room with the proprietary air of a daughter returning to her childhood home. "Father, the house looks wonderful. You've done marvels with it." "Your cousin's doing, actually," Colonel Fortescue said, and Miss Marple saw Celia's expression tighten almost imperceptibly. "Cousin Margaret is here?" "Not yet, but expected shortly. I thought it time to let bygones be bygones, my dear. It's Christmas, after all." George Prentice, a portly man with shrewd eyes and an air of careful calculation, interjected smoothly. "Very generous of you, Colonel. Family unity is so important, particularly at this time of year." His tone suggested he thought no such thing, but social convention required the sentiment. Miss Marple wondered how Prentice had really felt about the protracted legal battle over the inheritance. His wife stood to gain considerably from her father's ownership of Greenways, and Margaret Fenwick's claim had threatened that. The final guest arrived, as Parsons was circulating with more sherry. Margaret Fenwick was announced, and the room fell into one of those sudden silences that reveal more than any amount of conversation. She was a woman of perhaps 50, dressed severely in black, despite the festive season. Her face was handsome rather than pretty, with strong bones and intelligent eyes that swept the room in a single comprehensive glance before settling on Colonel Fortescue. "Roland, how kind of you to invite me." Her voice was deep and controlled, with only the slightest edge that suggested the effort this reconciliation required. "Margaret, delighted you could come." The colonel moved forward, and they shook hands with the formality of treaty negotiations. "You know most of the company, I think. May I present Miss Marple, a very dear friend of the late Mrs. Bantry." "We've met," Margaret Fenwick said, and her expression softened fractionally. "Years ago, when Aunt Dorothea was still alive, you were kind enough to help with a church fete." Miss Marple remembered now, a much younger Margaret, before bitterness had carved those lines around her mouth. "Of course, the White Elephant stall. You were staying here for the summer." "A different lifetime," Margaret said, accepting sherry from Parsons. Her gaze moved around the room again, lingering on Adrian Fortescue with what might have been calculation, on Celia Prentice with something colder, and on Miss Winters with undisguised curiosity. "Well," Colonel Fortescue said with determined heartiness, "we're all assembled. What a splendid turnout. Shall we move through to the dining room? Mrs. Beale will have my head if we let her dinner spoil." The dining room had been transformed into something from a Victorian print. The long mahogany table gleamed with polish, set with what Miss Marple recognized as the Fortescue family silver, not the finest quality perhaps, but respectable and heavy with tradition. Candles in silver candlesticks cast a warm glow, and a massive arrangement of holly, ivy and hothouse roses dominated the center of the table. Miss Marple found herself seated between the vicar and Major Wentworth, a placement that suggested she was considered safe and uncontroversial. Across from her sat Dr. Pettigrew and his wife, with Miss Winters to Mrs. Pettigrew's left. The Colonel presided at the head of the table, with Margaret Fenwick placed strategically at the opposite end, honoured position or subtle exile, depending on one's interpretation. The meal began with oysters, and conversation was initially constrained by the demands of food and polite attention to one's immediate neighbours. Major Wentworth launched into an anecdote about Christmas dinner in a dugout in 1915, and Miss Marple made appropriate sounds of interest while observing the table's dynamics. Adrian Fortescue was being charming to his aunt by marriage, Celia Prentice, who responded with brittle laughter. George Prentice watched them both with the alertness of a man who counted costs. Miss Winters ate methodically, speaking only when directly addressed. Dr. Pettigrew attended to his wife with anxious care, cutting her food as though she were an invalid, while Mrs. Pettigrew herself seemed to exist in a fog of tremulous half-awareness. And at the far end of the table, Margaret Fenwick sat in isolated dignity, making no attempt to force conversation with her neighbours, Miss Harriet Wentworth on one side, Mrs. Clement on the other. Both women, Miss Marple noted, seemed distinctly uncomfortable, as though unsure how to address someone who had so recently been cast as the family villain. The soup course came and went. The fish course followed. The conversation grew more animated as the wine flowed, voices rising and overlapping. Mrs. Clement was telling Miss Winters about the village Christmas pageant. Adrian Fortescue and his uncle were discussing investments. The Pettigrews conversed in low, urgent whispers. Then, as Parsons was clearing plates for the main course, Margaret Fenwick's voice cut through the general noise with startling clarity. "Tell me, Colonel, have you discovered yet what became of Aunt Dorothea's diamonds? The ones she promised me before she died?" The silence was absolute. Even Parsons froze mid-reach, a plate suspended in his hands. Colonel Fortescue's face had gone a deep red. "I beg your pardon." "The diamond Paralles," Margaret continued, her voice perfectly calm. "Necklace, bracelet, earrings, and brooch. Aunt Dorothea told me explicitly, in the presence of witnesses, that they were to be mine. Yet, they weren't mentioned in the inventory, were they? I've often wondered where they went." "There were no diamonds," the Colonel said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "If there had been, they would have been listed with the estate. Are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting nothing. I'm simply inquiring. After all, if we're to have a reconciliation, we ought to clear the air completely. Don't you agree, Miss Winters?" Every head turned toward the secretary, who had gone quite pale. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Miss Winters said quietly. "Don't you? How odd. I should have thought, given your connection to the family. But perhaps I'm mistaken." Margaret's smile was perfectly pleasant, and absolutely chilling. "Do forgive me. Christmas Eve is perhaps not the time for old mysteries." "Indeed it is not," Colonel Fortescue said with icy precision. "If there's something you wish to discuss, Margaret, we can do so privately, not in front of my guests. But we're all family here, aren't we? Or friends of the family at least." Margaret's gaze swept the table again. "I simply thought, since we're all gathered together under one roof, it might be the perfect time to resolve certain uncertainties." Adrian Fortescue spoke for the first time since the exchange began, his voice smooth and diplomatic. "Miss Fenwick, I'm sure we all appreciate your candor, but my uncle is quite right. This isn't the appropriate venue. Perhaps after dinner. After dinner, people will be tired and full of food and wine. Now seems ideal to me." Margaret set down her wineglass with careful precision. "But as you wish, I can wait. I've waited 4 years after all. A few more hours can hardly matter." The main course, roast goose with all the traditional accompaniments, was served into an atmosphere of excruciating tension. Miss Marple ate mechanically, her mind working through what she had just witnessed. The missing diamonds were interesting, certainly, but more interesting was Margaret Fenwick's pointed question to Miss Winters. What connection could a London secretary have to the Fortescue family that would make her relevant to a discussion of missing jewellery? Unless, of course, Miss Winters wasn't simply a secretary at all. Miss Marple looked at the young woman again, more carefully this time. Yes, there was definitely something familiar about her. Something in the set of her features that echoed, what, or whom? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp cry. Mrs. Pettigrew had half risen from her seat, her face suddenly animated with distress. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I don't feel well. The room is spinning. Richard, I need—" She swayed, and her husband leaped up to catch her. "Helen, what is it? What's wrong?" "Just dizzy. Air. I need air." Dr. Pettigrew looked around helplessly. Perhaps if she could lie down somewhere, just for a few moments? Colonel Fortescue stood immediately. "Of course, the blue room is prepared upstairs. Parsons, if you'll show the way. Doctor, please take all the time you need." As the Pettigrews departed, the doctor half carrying his wife, the remaining guests exchanged glances. Miss Marple noticed that Adrian Fortescue looked genuinely concerned, while Miss Winters had gone very still, her hands clenched in her lap. "Poor child," Mrs. Clement murmured. "She's always been delicate." "Has she?" Miss Harriet Wentworth's voice was dry. "I understood she was quite robust before her marriage. Village gossip, of course, but one does hear things." The meal resumed. But the festive atmosphere had been thoroughly punctured. Conversation limped along in fits and starts. When the dessert, a magnificent Christmas pudding, was brought in with the traditional flaming brandy, there was a half-hearted attempt at cheer, but it fell flat. Colonel Fortescue proposed a toast to Christmas, which was drunk in near silence. It was as they were rising from the table to adjourn to the drawing-room that Miss Marple noticed something odd. Margaret Fenwick had left her wineglass 3/4 full throughout the meal, despite Parsons's repeated attempts to refill it, and when she stood, she swayed just slightly, steadying herself against the chair back. "Are you quite well, Margaret?" the Colonel asked, his tone suggesting the question was purely formal. "Perfectly well, thank you." But her voice was less controlled than before, her words just fractionally blurred. They moved to the drawing-room, where coffee and liqueurs awaited. Dr. Pettigrew reappeared after 20 minutes, looking harassed. "She's sleeping," he reported. "I've given her a mild sedative. She should rest comfortably. My apologies for the disruption." "Not at all," Colonel Fortescue said. "These things happen. Will you stay, or do you need to remain with her?" "I'll stay for coffee, if I may. She's quite safe. I've locked the door so she won't wander if she wakes confused." As coffee was being served, Miss Marple positioned herself near the window, ostensibly to admire the snow that had begun falling again. In reality, she was observing Margaret Fenwick, who had seated herself in a corner chair and accepted a small glass of brandy from Parsons. The woman's behaviour was increasingly peculiar. Her usual fierce control seemed to be slipping. She stared into a brandy glass with an expression that was almost bewildered, as though uncertain how it had come into her hand. When Miss Harriet Wentworth attempted conversation, Margaret's responses were vague and oddly slurred. And then, quite suddenly, Margaret Fenwick stood up, swayed dangerously, and gasped. Something's wrong. I feel—" She took 2 steps toward the center of the room, and collapsed. The elegant Christmas gathering dissolved into chaos. Chapter 3. The Body in the Drawing Room. Dr. Pettigrew reached Margaret Fenwick first, dropping to his knees beside the collapsed woman with professional speed. His fingers found her wrist, pressed against the pulse point, then moved to her neck. The room held its breath as he worked, his face growing progressively graver. "Everyone stand back," he commanded, his voice sharp with authority. "Give her air. Colonel, have someone telephone for an ambulance immediately." "Is it her heart?" Colonel Fortescue asked, already moving toward the hall. "I don't." The doctor broke off, bending closer to examine Margaret's face. His expression changed, something between alarm and confusion crossing his features. "This isn't a heart attack." "Then what is it?" Adrian Fortescue demanded. He had moved forward as well, his urbanity stripped away by genuine concern. Dr. Pettigrew didn't answer immediately. He was examining Margaret's pupils, then her mouth, his movements growing more urgent. Finally he sat back on his heels and looked up at the assembled company, his face ashen. "She's been poisoned." The word fell into the drawing room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the gathered guests. For a moment no one spoke. No one seemed able to speak. Then Celia Prentice, standing by the fireplace with one hand pressed to her throat, whispered, "Is she? She's alive," Dr. Pettigrew said, though his tone suggested this state of affairs might not continue. "But her condition is critical. The ambulance must come immediately." And he looked directly at Colonel Fortescue. "You must telephone the police as well." "The police?" The colonel seemed unable to grasp the implication. "But surely if it's a medical emergency, if I'm correct about what she's ingested, this is no accident. Someone has deliberately poisoned this woman." Miss Marple, still standing by the window where the tumult had caught her, observed the effect of this pronouncement on the assembled company. Shock, certainly, on every face. But shock manifested differently in different people, and within those variations lay meaning. George Prentice had gone quite red, his naturally florid complexion deepening to an alarming hue. His hand had tightened on his wife's arm. Celia, by contrast, had gone white as chalk. Adrian Fortescue looked stunned, his mouth slightly open, his usual polish entirely absent. Miss Winters sat frozen in her chair, her coffee cup suspended halfway to her lips as though turned to stone. Miss Harriet Wentworth had leaned forward, her sharp features alert with what looked almost like interest, academic curiosity at the appearance of a real puzzle. Major Wentworth was sputtering, his mustaches quivering with indignation. The vicar and his wife had drawn together, their faces mirrors of bewilderment and distress. And Colonel Fortescue himself stood in the centre of his drawing room, a man watching his carefully orchestrated reconciliation transform into nightmare. "I'll telephone," he said at last, his voice hollow. "Parsons, Parsons, where the devil is the man?" The butler appeared from the dining room, where he had presumably been overseeing the clearing of the table. "Telephone for an ambulance." "And for Inspector," the colonel paused, clearly trying to recall the name of the local police inspector, Inspector Slack. "Tell him there's been an incident at Greenways Manor, a serious incident." As Parsons hurried away, Dr. Pettigrew returned his attention to his patient. Margaret Fenwick lay motionless on the Persian carpet, her breathing shallow but regular. Her face had taken on a peculiar hue, not the blue of oxygen deprivation, but something more subtle, a greyish pallor that Miss Marple found deeply disturbing. "What did you mean if you're correct about what she's ingested?" Miss Marple asked quietly, moving closer. Her voice was gentle but clear, cutting through the general confusion. "You recognize the symptoms?" The doctor glanced up at her, and in his eyes Miss Marple saw both expertise and fear. "The pupils, the collapse, the colour, if I'm right, and God knows I hope I'm wrong, it's some form of alkaloid, possibly even," he lowered his voice, "possibly even belladonna, or a related compound. Deadly nightshade." Miss Harriet Wentworth had overheard. Her scholarly interest was now fully engaged. "But surely that would be impossibly difficult to administer." "The taste is quite distinctive, I understand. In sufficient quantity and properly prepared. It could be masked," Dr. Pettigrew said grimly. "In wine perhaps, or some strongly flavoured liqueur." Every eye turned to the small glass of brandy that stood on the occasional table beside Margaret Fenwick's abandoned chair. Miss Marple moved toward it before anyone else could react, but she didn't touch it. Instead, she bent slightly, examining the glass and its contents with careful attention. "No one must disturb this," she said firmly. "The police will want to examine it." "Quite right, Miss Marple," the vicar said, seeming grateful for decisive action from any quarter. "Perhaps we should all, that is, I think we should remain here, shouldn't we, until the police arrive?" "Indeed we should," Miss Marple agreed. "And perhaps we should also consider where everyone was when Miss Fenwick took her brandy." There was a moment of startled silence as the implication of this suggestion registered. Then Adrian Fortescue spoke, his voice tight. "Are you suggesting that one of us—" "I'm suggesting nothing, Mr. Fortescue," Miss Marple said mildly. "But the police will certainly want to know these things. It seems sensible to begin recalling while memories are fresh." Colonel Fortescue had regained some of his composure. "Miss Marple is quite right. We must approach this methodically." Parsons served the brandy from the sideboard. "I believe, Parsons?" The butler had returned and stood in the doorway, his face grey with shock. "Yes, sir, from the Hennessy decanter. The same brandy we've been serving all evening." "And you poured it yourself?" "Yes, sir, into a clean glass from the tray. I carried it directly to Miss Fenwick and placed it on the table beside her chair." "Did anyone approach her after that?" Miss Marple asked. "Before she drank?" There was a general murmur, as people tried to remember. Miss Marple herself had been standing at the window, her back partially to the room, admiring the snowfall. She had not seen exactly when Margaret had taken up the glass. I believe I did, Mrs. Clement said hesitantly. That is, I walked past her chair on my way to speak with Celia, but I certainly didn't touch her glass. I was near her as well, Miss Harriet Wentworth added. We had been having a brief conversation about medieval marriage customs. Quite interesting, actually, but I moved away when she received her brandy. One doesn't like to hover. I never left my position by the fire, George Prentice stated flatly. My wife can confirm it. Celia nodded, though her expression suggested she was barely following the conversation. She seemed to be in a state of shock, her eyes distant and unfocused. Adrian Fortescue frowned. I was speaking with Uncle by the sideboard, discussing the port wine he was considering for after coffee. We were there for several minutes. And you, Miss Winters? Miss Marple asked gently. The secretary started slightly, as though she had forgotten she might be included in this inventory. I believe I was standing near the piano, looking at the music. I didn't go anywhere near Miss Fenwick. I can confirm that, Dr. Pettigrew said unexpectedly. I noticed Miss Winters by the piano when I came back down from settling my wife. She was examining some sheet music. Schubert, I think. The doctor's testimony seemed to relieve Miss Winters considerably. Some of the tension left her shoulders, though her face remained pale. So, Miss Marple said, as though summarizing a parish meeting agenda, we have Mrs. Clement and Miss Wentworth, who were near Miss Fenwick at various times, but neither claims to have touched the glass. The rest of us were distributed about the room, generally at some distance from her chair, which means nothing. Major Wentworth rumbled. Glass could have been poisoned earlier, before it was filled, or the brandy itself could be tainted. No? Parsons interjected, his professional pride overcoming his shock. Begging your pardon, sir, but the other gentlemen had brandy from the same decanter, Mr. Adrian and Mr. Prentice both. If the brandy itself were poisoned, they'd be affected as well. This was incontrovertible logic, and it deepened the silence that followed. If neither the glass nor the brandy were poisoned before serving, then the poison had to have been administered after Parsons placed the glass beside Margaret Fenwick's chair. But how, and by whom? Miss Marple's gaze travelled around the room, noting details. The arrangement of furniture meant that Margaret's chair, while in the corner, was not particularly isolated. Someone moving between the coffee service and the seating area would pass quite close to it. Someone reaching for the sugar or cream might have to reach past it. And the lighting, while adequate, was not brilliant. The combination of candles and electric lamps created pools of brightness and shadow. A quick, practiced movement might go unnoticed in such conditions, particularly when everyone's attention was scattered among multiple conversations. The ambulance is coming, Parsons announced, and Inspector Slack says he'll be here within the half hour. Half an hour, Colonel Fortescue repeated numbly. He looked down at his house guest, lying unconscious on his carpet, at the assembled company now eyeing each other with varying degrees of suspicion, at the Christmas decorations that now seemed macabrely festive. This was meant to be a reconciliation, a new beginning. So it may yet prove, Miss Marple said quietly. Though perhaps not in the way you anticipated. Dr. Pettigrew was checking Margaret's vital signs again. Her breathing is becoming more laboured. Where is that ambulance? Could she die? Celia Prentice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She could, the doctor admitted. The next few hours will be critical, if the dose was sufficient. He didn't complete the thought. Miss Marple moved to the window again, ostensibly to watch for the ambulance, but actually to think. Poison was traditionally considered a woman's weapon, though of course men used it as well. More significantly, poison required planning and opportunity. It couldn't be a crime of passion or sudden impulse. Someone had brought that poison to Greenways Manor, concealed it on their person, and waited for the right moment to use it, which suggested premeditation, which suggested motive, and motive, in Miss Marple's experience, usually connected to one of several things: money, love, fear, or revenge. Sometimes all four. Margaret Fenwick had arrived here tonight as a dispossessed heir, invited back into the fold by the man who had inherited what she believed should have been hers. She had immediately raised the matter of missing diamonds and made cryptic remarks to Miss Winters about family connections. She had been bitter, confrontational, and perhaps most importantly, she had known something that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. But who? And what? Miss Marple was still pondering these questions when the ambulance arrived, its bell clanging through the snowy night. Two efficient attendants entered with a stretcher, conferred briefly with Dr. Pettigrew, and then carefully lifted Margaret Fenwick's unconscious form. As they carried her out, Miss Marple noticed something that had been hidden beneath the woman's body, a small handkerchief embroidered with initials. Not MF for Margaret Fenwick. The initials were HP. Miss Marple bent and picked up the handkerchief using the very tips of her fingers. She said nothing, but she held it up where Dr. Pettigrew could see it. The doctor's face went, if possible, even more ashen than before. "That's my wife's," he said hoarsely. "But I don't understand. Helen never came downstairs after I took her up. She's been locked in the bedroom the entire time." "Are you quite certain?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I locked the door myself." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "you should go upstairs and check that she is still there." The doctor stared at her for a moment, then turned and ran from the room. The sound of his feet pounding up the stairs was unnaturally loud in the shocked silence. They waited. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked with ponderous regularity. The fire crackled. Outside, the ambulance departed, carrying its critical cargo towards St. Mary Mead Hospital, and an uncertain fate. Then Dr. Pettigrew's voice, raised in alarm. "Helen, Helen, where are you?" He appeared at the top of the stairs, his face a mask of terror. "She's gone. The window's open. She's gone out into the snow." And with that, the nightmare Christmas gathering at Greenways Manor took yet another turn into the impossible. Chapter 4. Questions in the Snow. Inspector Slack arrived in a state of considerable irritation, having been called away from his own Christmas Eve celebrations. He was a large, red-faced man with a perpetual air of aggrievement, and his relationship with Miss Marple, whom he had encountered during several previous village incidents, could best be described as one of grudging respect tinged with exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, upon entering the drawing-room and immediately spotting her by the window. "I might have known. Can't have a proper crime in St. Mary Mead without you turning up like a bad penny." "Good evening, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with unruffled courtesy. "How unfortunate that you should be disturbed on Christmas Eve, though I suppose murder doesn't keep a calendar." "Not murder yet," Slack said brusquely. "Attempted murder, if Dr. Pettigrew's diagnosis is correct, though I'll want the hospital's confirmation before I go making official statements." He surveyed the assembled company with a policeman's practiced eye. "Now then, I understand everyone present is to remain here until I've taken preliminary statements. Colonel Fortescue, is there a room I might use for interviews?" "The library," the colonel offered. "It's just across the hall." "Very good. And someone had better find that missing woman." Constable Polk, a young uniformed officer appeared, looking nervous. "Sir, take one of the guests, someone who knows the grounds, and search for a Mrs. Pettigrew, blonde woman, delicate build, possibly distressed. She's apparently wandered out into the snow in evening clothes. If you don't find her within 20 minutes, we'll need to organize a proper search party." Dr. Pettigrew stepped forward. "I should go. She's my wife, and she knows me." "If she's confused, you'll stay here," Slack said flatly. "You're a material witness to a poisoning, and your wife's handkerchief was found under the victim. I'll need a statement from you first." "Anyone else familiar with the grounds?" "I know them well," Adrian Fortescue said. "I spent summers here as a boy. I can show your constable the obvious places. The Folly, the old greenhouse, the summer house by the pond." Slack nodded. "Go on then. But 20 minutes, mind. If she's out there longer than that in this weather, we're looking at a very different situation." As Adrian and Constable Polk departed, the inspector turned his attention to the room at large. "Right. Dr. Pettigrew, you first. The rest of you," his gaze swept across them, "will remain here. No one is to leave this room without my permission, and no one is to discuss the incident among yourselves. Is that clear?" There was a general murmur of assent. Slack jerked his head toward the library, and Dr. Pettigrew followed him with the air of a man walking to his own execution. The remaining guests arranged themselves uncomfortably about the drawing room. The earlier festive atmosphere had entirely evaporated, replaced by a tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Parsons had withdrawn to the dining room, leaving them without even the social lubricant of more coffee or liquor. Miss Marple resumed her seat by the window, taking up her knitting bag. She had brought her work naturally, thinking the evening might include some quiet conversation in which knitting would be appropriate. Now the click of her needles was the only sound in the room, save for the crackling fire and the relentless ticking of the clock. Celia Prentice had begun to cry softly, her husband patting her shoulder with mechanical regularity. Miss Harriet Wentworth sat bolt upright in her chair, her expression one of fierce concentration, as though mentally cataloguing everything she had observed. Major Wentworth had fallen into a doze in his armchair, Shock affected people differently, Miss Marple reflected, and his particular constitution apparently responded by shutting down. The vicar and Mrs. Clement huddled together on the sofa, speaking in whispers despite the inspector's injunction, and Miss Winters sat alone by the piano, her hands folded in her lap, her face a careful blank. After 20 minutes, Adrian Fortescue and Constable Pulk returned, snow-dusting their evening clothes. Adrian shook his head in response to Colonel Fortescue's unspoken question. No sign of her. We checked all the outbuildings, the folly, even the old ice house. There are no footprints in the fresh snow around any of them. But she must have gone somewhere, the colonel protested. If she went out the window, she didn't go far, Adrian said grimly. Either she's hiding somewhere very close to the house, or, he didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood, or she never left at all, or she's lying in the snow somewhere, already beyond help. Inspector Slack emerged from the library, his expression grim. Constable, organize a proper search. Use the ground staff if any are available. I want every inch of the property covered. He consulted his notebook. Miss Winters, you're next. With me, please. The secretary rose and followed him with remarkable composure, though Miss Marple noticed her hands were trembling slightly. The library door closed behind them. This is intolerable, George Prentice said suddenly, his voice tight with suppressed fury. We're being treated like criminals. Inspector Slack seems to think one of us deliberately poisoned Margaret Fenwick. Well, someone did, Miss Harriet Wentworth observed tartly, unless you're suggesting she poisoned herself, which seems rather unlikely. But it could have been anyone. A servant. Someone who came in from outside. All the servants were accounted for. Miss Marple interjected gently, not looking up from her knitting. Parsons was in the room with us. Mrs. Beale was in the kitchen with the scullery maid, and the daily woman from the village. The colonel's man Fred was in his quarters above the stables. I saw the light in his window when I arrived, and no one came in from outside. The snow would have shown footprints. Prentice stared at her. You seem remarkably well informed, Miss Marple. I observe, she said simply. It's a habit of long standing, and what I observe at present is that someone in this house, someone who was in this room earlier this evening, administered a potentially fatal poison to Miss Fenwick. The question we must ask ourselves is why. That's obvious, surely, Celia Prentice said through her tears. Margaret was making threats. She talked about the missing diamonds. She made that horrid insinuation about Miss Winters. She was trying to destroy father's reconciliation. Was she? Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Or was she trying to expose a truth that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden? Colonel Fortescue, who had been standing by the fireplace in stunned silence, suddenly spoke. Miss Marple, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Colonel, that you might tell us about the diamonds, the ones your late wife promised to Miss Fenwick. The colonel's face darkened. There were no diamonds. That was Margaret's fantasy, created to support her claim on the estate. But there were diamonds once, weren't there? Miss Marple persisted gently. A para that came into your wife's family from her grandmother, rather valuable pieces. I understand. Old-fashioned settings, but the stones themselves quite fine. The room had gone very still. Even Celia had stopped crying, staring at her father with dawning horror. How could you possibly know that? The colonel demanded. Because your late wife showed them to me once, years ago when I visited for the church fete. She was very proud of them. They had belonged to her grandmother, as I said, and she spoke of them as an heirloom that would pass to the next generation. They were sold, the colonel said, after a long pause. 5 years ago, before my wife died. She needed the money for medical treatments that weren't covered by insurance. I assumed Margaret knew that, but apparently she preferred to create a conspiracy rather than accept the truth. Can you prove they were sold? Miss Harriet Wentworth asked with her characteristic directness. I assume there are records, receipts from the jeweler, though I don't know where they might be kept. My wife handled that side of things. How very convenient, Celia whispered. Father, you didn't. I did not sell my wife's diamonds and pocket the proceeds. If that's what you're implying. The colonel's face was now dangerously red. Good God, what do you take me for? Before anyone could respond, Inspector Slack returned with Miss Winters, whose composure had evidently survived her interview intact. Mr. and Mrs. Prentice, you're next. Both of you together, I think. As the couple rose and followed the inspector, Miss Marple found herself studying Miss Winters more closely. The young woman had returned to her seat by the piano, but instead of the relieved expression one might expect after surviving police questioning, she looked troubled, more troubled, in fact, than she had before. "Miss Winters," Miss Marple said quietly. "Forgive an old woman's curiosity, but what did Miss Fenwick mean when she spoke of your connection to the family?" Miss Winters' head jerked up, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with sudden wariness. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. There's something about you that's familiar. Something in your features. At first I couldn't place it, but now I think I see it. You have your grandmother's eyes, don't you?" The silence that followed this observation was profound. Miss Winters had gone very white, her hands gripping the edge of the piano bench. "My grandmother," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "Dorothea Fortescue," Miss Marple said gently. "The Colonel's late wife, which would make you her granddaughter," Miss Winters finished, the words seeming to tear themselves from her throat. Yes, I'm Dorothea Fortescue's granddaughter. My mother was her daughter, her first daughter, born before her marriage to the Colonel. The daughter no one talks about. The daughter who was given up for adoption because it wouldn't do for a young woman of good family to have a child out of wedlock. The revelations hung in the air like smoke. Adrian Fortescue, who had been standing by the door, moved forward slowly, his face a study in shock. "You're saying, you're my cousin? That would make you—" "It makes me nothing," Miss Winters said bitterly. "I have no claim on this family. My mother died 5 years ago, never having met her birth mother. I only learned the truth from papers she left behind. I didn't come here to make demands or seek recognition. I simply wanted to see the place, to understand where I came from." "But you came with Adrian," Colonel Fortescue said, and his voice was suddenly very old. "As his secretary, did you know Adrian? Did you know who she was?" "No." Adrian's shock appeared genuine. "I had no idea." Miss Winters answered an advertisement. "She had excellent references. She never mentioned any connection to our family." "Because there is no connection," Miss Winters insisted. "Not legally. I'm no one's heir. I have no rights to anything here. I just wanted to see." She broke off, unable to continue. And in that moment, Miss Marple understood several things that had been puzzling her. The young woman's careful observation of everyone at dinner, her interest in the house and its occupants, the way Margaret Fenwick had looked at her, with knowledge and perhaps with pity. "Miss Fenwick knew," Miss Marple said. "That's what she meant about your connection to the family. Somehow, she had discovered your identity." Miss Winters nodded miserably. "She approached me before dinner, in the hall. She said she'd done research into the family history, that she'd found records of my grandmother's first pregnancy. She said," Miss Winters swallowed hard. "She said she was sorry for what had been done to my mother, to me. She said the diamonds should have been mine by rights, as the eldest grandchild, and that she intended to make sure I received them." "The diamonds again," Miss Harriet Wentworth murmured. "Always these mysterious diamonds." "But if they were sold," the vicar began hesitantly. "Were they?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes on Colonel Fortescue. "Or is that simply a convenient story?" The Colonel opened his mouth to reply, but before he could speak, there was a commotion from the hall. Constable Polk burst in, snow-covered and breathless. Inspector Slack, we've found her. We've found Mrs. Pettigrew. She's in the old summer house by the pond. And sir," the young constable's face was grey with shock, "she's dead." Chapter 5. Patterns and Parallels. The death of Helen Pettigrew transformed Inspector Slack's investigation from attempted murder to something far more complex. As the police surgeon examined the body in the frigid summer house, a small octagonal structure with glass panels, now frosted with ice, Miss Marple stood in the library with the other guests, her knitting needles moving with steady rhythm, while her mind worked through the patterns emerging from the evening's horrors. "Exposure," the surgeon pronounced, returning to the house an hour later. "She's been dead perhaps 40 minutes. In her condition, sedated, dressed only in evening clothes, wandering in sub-zero temperatures, she wouldn't have lasted long. Add in possible confusion or disorientation." "But how did she get out?" Dr. Pettigrew demanded. He had been pacing the library like a caged animal since the body was discovered. "I locked the bedroom door. I know I locked it. The lock was not forced," Constable Polk reported. "And there's a key in the door, on the inside." "Then she unlocked it herself," Inspector Slack said flatly. "Which suggests she was not as sedated as you believed, Doctor. But she was barely conscious when I left her. She couldn't have." Pettigrew broke off, his face crumpling. "Oh God, this is my fault. If I had stayed with her, if I had been more careful with the dosage, you would have had a sedated wife," But still no answer to the evening's first mystery, Miss Marple interjected quietly. The question we must ask, Doctor, is not whether you adequately sedated Mrs. Pettigrew, but whether she left that bedroom voluntarily. Everyone turned to stare at her. Are you suggesting someone took her? Inspector Slack demanded. I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking, that we have been proceeding on certain assumptions that may not be correct. We assume that Mrs. Pettigrew wandered out in confusion. But what if she went to the summer house deliberately? What if she went there to meet someone? In the middle of a poisoning investigation? That's absurd. George Prentice scoffed. Is it? Consider the sequence of events. Mrs. Pettigrew became ill at dinner, though whether genuinely ill or feigning, we cannot know. She was taken upstairs and sedated. Shortly thereafter, Miss Fenwick was poisoned. While we were all gathered around Miss Fenwick's body, Mrs. Pettigrew left her room and made her way to the summer house, where she subsequently died of exposure. Miss Marple paused, her gaze travelling around the assembled company. That is quite a remarkable coincidence, is it not? 2 women stricken, one by poison and one by exposure, within the space of 2 hours, at the same social gathering. What are you implying, Miss Marple? Colonel Fortescue asked heavily. I'm implying that perhaps Mrs. Pettigrew's death was not accidental at all, that perhaps someone lured her to the summer house, knowing that in her sedated state she would succumb to the cold before she could return. Or perhaps, Miss Marple's voice grew even quieter, someone ensured she would not return at all. Inspector Slack had pulled out his notebook and was writing furiously. This is speculation, Miss Marple. Do you have any evidence to support it? Only observation and a lifetime study of human nature, Inspector. But let me ask you this. Did you examine Mrs. Pettigrew's feet? The question was so unexpected that Slack blinked. Her feet? Why would I? Because if she walked through the snow to the summer house, her evening slippers would have been soaked through and likely fallen apart. Yet, I saw them when Constable Palk made his report, before the body was moved. They were wet, certainly, but not destroyed, which suggests either that she did not walk through deep snow, or that her journey was very short. The summer house is quite some distance from the house. The paths were partially cleared earlier, Adrian Fortescue offered. For the guest's arrival, she might have followed those. Possibly, Miss Marple acknowledged. But they were not cleared all the way to the summer house, were they? That's a decorative structure, not regularly visited in winter. Inspector Slack's expression had shifted from irritation to grudging interest. Go on. I would also like to know, Miss Marple continued, whether there was any sign in the summer house of a struggle. Any indication that Mrs. Pettigrew was not alone when she died. The snow around the structure is trampled now, Constable Palk admitted. The search party mucked it up before we realized what we'd found. But I did notice, that is, it seemed like there might have been more than one set of prints leading to the door. Might have been, Slack said sourly. Not exactly conclusive evidence. No, Miss Marple agreed. But added to the other curious circumstances, Mrs. Pettigrew's handkerchief under Miss Fenwick's body, for instance, it begins to suggest a pattern. What pattern? Dr. Pettigrew's voice was anguished. What are you saying about my wife? Miss Marple looked at him with genuine compassion. I'm saying, Doctor, that your wife may have known something about the poisoning of Miss Fenwick, that she may have seen something, or understood something, that made her dangerous to the killer, and that she was eliminated before she could share that knowledge. The doctor staggered slightly, and Adrian Fortescue moved to support him. That's monstrous. Helen wouldn't have kept silent if she'd witnessed a murder attempt. She was a good woman, a kind woman. I'm sure she was, Miss Marple said gently. But even good people can be afraid, especially of someone they trust. Someone they have reason to fear. There was a long silence as the implications of this settled over the room. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a snap. Right. This changes everything. We're no longer dealing with one incident but 2, possibly connected. Everyone's movements for the entire evening need to be accounted for. Colonel, I'll need a plan of the house and grounds. I want to know every exit, every staircase, every possible route from the bedroom to the summer house. As the Colonel moved to fetch the requested materials, Miss Marple continued her knitting, but her mind was working through the puzzle with the same methodical precision her needles showed. She was reminded of a case years ago in St. Ul's, Mary Mead, the Fletcher sisters and their disputed inheritance, ending with one sister dead at the bottom of the stairs. Everyone had assumed an accident, until Miss Marple had noticed the marks on the banister suggesting a struggle, and the peculiar distribution of the deceased's belongings in her pockets. as though she had been dressed after death. This case had similar elements: disputed inheritance, family tensions, death masquerading as accident or natural cause. But it was more complex, with more actors, and more layers of deception. The diamonds were key, she was certain, not their monetary value so much as what they represented. Proof of claims and counterclaims, evidence of old secrets and new lies. Miss Fenwick had known something about those diamonds. Miss Winters, as the newly revealed granddaughter, had a legitimate interest in them, and someone, somewhere in this house, was desperate enough to kill to keep those secrets hidden. But who? And why now? After years of relative stability. Inspector Slack returned with the house plans, spreading them across the library table. Now then, let's establish exactly where everyone was between the time Miss Fenwick collapsed and the discovery that Mrs. Pettigrew had left her room. That's roughly 40 minutes. Dr. Pettigrew, I was with my wife initially, then downstairs in the drawing room. I never left that room until we realized Helen was missing. Can anyone confirm that? Slack's tone was sharp. We all can, Mrs. Clement said. Dr. Pettigrew was quite visible the entire time, pacing near the fireplace. Slack made a note. Mr. Adrian Fortescue. In the drawing room as well, until I went out with Constable Polk to search for Mrs. Pettigrew. Miss Winters? I never left the drawing room either. The inventory continued. Everyone claimed to have remained in the drawing room under Inspector Slack's injunction not to leave, but Miss Marple, observing each person as they spoke, noted the small tells that suggested not everyone was being entirely truthful. Celia Prentice's eyes had shifted left when confirming her husband's alibi. George Prentice himself had hesitated fractionally before stating he'd never moved from his chair, and Miss Harriet Wentworth's assertion that she'd been reading by the lamp in the corner came just a bit too quickly, as though rehearsed. Any of them might have slipped out during the confusion following Miss Fenwick's collapse. The drawing room doors opened onto the main hall, which connected to the rear of the house. A quick trip upstairs, a whispered message through the bedroom door, an invitation to the summer house. It would have taken only minutes, and in the general chaos, with everyone's attention on the poisoning victim, such an absence might easily have gone unnoticed. Inspector Slack was thinking along similar lines. The bedroom where Mrs. Pettigrew was resting. It faces the rear of the house. Yes, Colonel Fortescue confirmed, consulting the plan. Second floor, east wing. The window looks out over the gardens toward the summer house. Could someone have communicated with her from outside? Thrown stones at the window perhaps to wake her? Possible, I suppose. But why would she respond? Why would she get up, unlock the door, and make her way outside in her condition? Because, Miss Marple said quietly, she knew the person outside, trusted them, perhaps even loved them. Dr. Pettigrew made a strangled sound. What are you implying about my wife? Nothing improper, Doctor. But consider your wife had been seen taking tea with Mr. Adrian Fortescue at the Rose and Crown. Village gossip, as Mrs. Bantry mentioned to me. Perhaps innocent, as you both no doubt would claim, but perhaps also indicative of a friendship, or at least a connection, that went beyond casual acquaintance. Adrian Fortescue's urbane mask had cracked. Are you accusing me of luring Mrs. Pettigrew to her death? I'm observing, Miss Marple said, her tone still gentle, that you knew her, that you had opportunities to communicate with her, and that you volunteered to lead the search party, which would have given you an excellent opportunity to obscure any evidence in the snow before official eyes could examine it. That's preposterous. I went searching because I wanted to help, because I know the grounds, because you needed to ensure nothing incriminating was found. Inspector Slack finished, his voice hard. Miss Marple raises an interesting point. You also had access to the house, to the drinks tray, to Miss Fenwick, and you have a clear motive. She was threatening to expose Miss Winters's identity, which might complicate your own inheritance prospects. My inheritance is secure. The will was probated, the estate settled, unless, Miss Harriet Wentworth interjected suddenly, her scholar's mind engaging with the puzzle, unless the existence of an elder grandchild throws the succession into question. If Miss Winters can prove her lineage, and if the diamonds representing as they do an explicit bequest from the original owner can be shown to exist, then perhaps the entire settlement could be challenged. The room erupted in argument, Adrian protesting his innocence, George Prentice demanding to know what this meant for his wife's prospects, Colonel Fortescue insisting the matter was closed, Miss Winters sitting silent and pale while her existence was debated like a legal abstraction. Miss Marple's needles never stopped moving. She was thinking of another case, years ago, a young woman who had poisoned her rival for a man's affections, then when suspicion fell upon her, had staged a second accident to divert attention. The parallel was not exact, but it was suggestive. 2 women struck down on the same night, one by poison, one by exposure, one survived, one died. What pattern connected them? What did Mrs. Pettigrew know about Miss Fenwick's poisoning? Or, and this was the question that troubled Miss Marple most, had Mrs. Pettigrew herself been involved in the poisoning, only to be eliminated by her co-conspirator when the plan went awry? The handkerchief under Miss Fenwick's body suggested Mrs. Pettigrew had been near the collapsed woman. But when? Before the collapse, to administer poison, or after, to check whether the victim was truly dying? "Inspector," Miss Marple said, cutting through the arguments, "has there been any word from the hospital about Miss Fenwick's condition?" Slack pulled out his pocket watch. "Should have been news by now. Constable, see if there'd been any calls." While they waited, Miss Marple gathered her thoughts. The pattern was becoming clearer, though not yet complete. She thought of St. Mary Mead, of the small village dramas that revealed universal truths about human nature, the postmaster's wife and her secret lover, the Fletcher sisters and their lethal rivalry, the greengrocer's daughter and her calculated mercy-killing. People killed for predictable reasons: money, love, fear, revenge. Sometimes all 4, woven together in a tapestry of human weakness and desperation. The trick was to see which threads were genuine and which were false, which led to the heart of the crime and which were merely distraction. Constable Palk returned, his face grave. "Hospital rang 5 minutes ago, sir. Miss Fenwick has regained consciousness. She's asking to speak with someone from the house. He consulted his notes. With Miss Marple, specifically." Everyone turned to stare at the elderly woman by the window, who seemed unsurprised by this development. "Then, I suppose," Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting with deliberate care, "I had better go and hear what Miss Fenwick has to say. Inspector, would you care to accompany me?" "Indeed I would," Slack said grimly. "And we'll take statements from everyone else while we're gone. Colonel, no one is to leave these premises. Is that understood?" As Miss Marple collected her coat and prepared for the drive to the hospital, she noticed Miss Winters watching her with an expression of desperate hope. The young woman said nothing, but her eyes asked a question. Will this end? Will we finally know the truth? Miss Marple could not answer, but she felt a growing certainty that the truth, when it emerged, would surprise them all, because the truth, in her experience, was rarely what one first assumed. It hid in plain sight, disguised by expectations and assumptions, waiting for someone patient enough to see the pattern beneath the surface. And Miss Jane Marple, after 70 years of observing human nature in all its complexity, was very good indeed at seeing patterns. Chapter 6. The Testament of Margaret Fenwick. St. Mary Mead Hospital was a modest institution, built in the Victorian era, and expanded somewhat awkwardly in the 1920s. At 11:30 on Christmas Eve, it was quiet save for the night nurse's soft footsteps and the distant sound of carolers singing in the village square. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack were shown to a private room on the first floor, where Margaret Fenwick lay propped against pillows, her face still bearing that peculiar greyish pallor, but her eyes bright with fever and determination. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice hoarse but clear, "I knew you would be the one to understand. Not the police, though, no disrespect to you, Inspector. But Miss Marple sees things. She knows how people are. You wish to speak with me, Miss Fenwick?" Miss Marple said gently, settling into the chair beside the bed. "I'm very glad to see you conscious. We feared the worst." "You'll still fear the worst before this night is through," Margaret said grimly. "Inspector, are you recording this? You should record it. This is my testimony, in case I don't survive." "The doctor says you'll recover," Slack said, pulling out his notebook, nevertheless. The dose wasn't quite sufficient, apparently. A bitter smile crossed Margaret's face. "Sufficient for the purpose, though. My heart has been strained. The doctor mentioned that as well. Even if I live through tonight, I have perhaps a few months. Maybe a year, if I'm fortunate." She saw Miss Marple's expression and shook her head. "Don't pity me. I've known for some time. It's why I came back to Greenways, to set certain matters straight before I died." "The diamonds," Miss Marple said, "among other things." "But yes, the diamonds." Margaret shifted against her pillows, wincing. "Let me tell you a story, Miss Marple. A story about a young woman named Dorothea Blackwood, before she became Dorothea Fortescue. Miss Winter's grandmother," Miss Marple confirmed. Margaret's eyes widened fractionally. "So you know about that?" Good, it saves time. Yes, Dorothea Blackwood became pregnant at 19 by a man who refused to marry her. In 1895, this was a catastrophe. Her family sent her away to a home for unwed mothers. The child, a daughter, was given up for adoption immediately. This was before Dorothea married the colonel. 2 years before, the family hushed it up, paid everyone involved to forget. Dorothea was presented as having spent 2 years abroad, studying art in Florence. She came back, married Roland Fortescue, a respectable match if not a brilliant one, and they had 2 children. Adrian's father, and Celia, Miss Marple finished. Mrs. Prentice. No. Margaret's voice was sharp. That's what everyone believes. That's what the records show. But it's not the truth. Inspector Slack had stopped writing, his pen suspended above the page. What do you mean? Dorothea's first child, the adopted daughter, was given to a family named Blackwell. They changed her first name, but kept her birth date. That daughter grew up, married, and had a child of her own in 1920. She named her daughter Helen. The room seemed to tilt. Miss Marple sat very still, her mind racing through the implications. Helen Pettigrew, she whispered. Helen Pettigrew, Margaret confirmed. Not Miss Winters at all. Miss Winters is indeed connected to the family. I told her as much to see how she'd react, but she's a second cousin, nothing more. The real granddaughter, the eldest grandchild with a legitimate claim on the family estate, was Helen Pettigrew. And she knew? Slack demanded. She knew. Dorothea told her 2 years ago, when Helen first came to St. Mary Mead. Dorothea had spent years trying to trace her firstborn daughter, and when she finally succeeded, the woman was already dead. But the granddaughter lived. Dorothea wanted to make amends, wanted to provide for her. Hence the diamonds. They were to be Helen's inheritance, passed directly to her through the will. But they weren't in the will, Miss Marple said. No, because before Dorothea could formalize the bequest, she died, and the diamonds disappeared. Margaret's expression was bitter. I spent 3 years trying to prove they existed, trying to find them. I thought Roland had stolen them, hidden them away to keep Helen from her rightful inheritance. It's why I contested the will, why I fought so hard, not for myself, Miss Marple, but for justice. For that girl who had been deprived of her birthright. Did Helen know you were fighting for her? Miss Marple asked. No. She begged me not to. She was terrified of her true parentage becoming public. She'd married Richard Pettigrew under false pretenses, you see. He thought he was getting an ordinary young woman from an ordinary family. If he'd known the truth, that his wife was illegitimate, born of scandal, he might have rejected her, or so she feared. Inspector Slack was writing furiously now. So Helen Pettigrew stood to inherit a fortune, but was afraid to claim it. And someone poisoned you to keep this secret hidden. Someone poisoned me, Margaret agreed, but not to keep the secret. To silence me before I could reveal where the diamonds actually are. Miss Marple leaned forward. You know where they are? I discovered it yesterday. It's why I came tonight. Why I accepted Roland's invitation after years of animosity. I needed to be in that house. Needed to see how everyone reacted when I started asking questions. Margaret's breathing had become more laboured. The diamonds are still at Greenways Manor. They were never sold. Dorothea hid them before she died, presumably intending to give them to Helen privately, but she died before she could, and only one other person knew where she'd hidden them. Who? Slack demanded. But Margaret's attention had shifted to the doorway, where a nurse was hovering anxiously. Miss Fenwick, you really shouldn't excite yourself. I'm dying, you foolish woman. I'll excite myself if I please. Margaret turned back to Miss Marple. The person who killed Helen Pettigrew tonight is the same person who poisoned me, and they're still at Greenways Manor, probably destroying evidence as we speak. But who? Miss Marple asked gently. Miss Fenwick, you must tell us who. Margaret Fenwick closed her eyes, and for a moment Miss Marple feared she had lost consciousness. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. It's obvious, isn't it? Who would benefit from Helen's death and mine? Who had access to the house, to the bedroom where Helen was kept? Who knew about the diamonds, and where they're hidden? Miss Fenwick, Inspector Slack began urgently. But Margaret's eyes had closed, and the machines beside her bed began to emit an alarming sound. The nurse pushed past them, calling for the doctor. Within seconds the room was full of medical staff, and Miss Marple and the inspector were ushered out into the corridor. They waited, in tense silence. 10 minutes passed. 15. Finally, the doctor emerged. His face grave. She's stable, but she's slipped into unconsciousness. The excitement was too much for her damaged heart. She may wake again, but, he shrugged, I can't promise anything. Inspector Slack swore under his breath. She was about to tell us who the killer is. Not quite, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. She told us to work it out ourselves. She said it was obvious. Obvious? Nothing about this case is obvious. But Miss Marple was no longer listening. Her mind had gone very still, very focused, in the way it did when all the scattered pieces of a puzzle suddenly began to align themselves into a comprehensible pattern. Helen Pettigrew was not a frightened young wife wandering confused in the snow. She was Dorothea Fortescue's granddaughter, with a legitimate claim to a fortune. She had died not by accident, but by design, murdered by someone who stood to lose everything if her true identity became known. And Margaret Fenwick had been poisoned not to silence her accusations, but to prevent her from revealing where the diamonds were hidden. Diamonds that represented proof of Helen's claims. 2 women eliminated on the same night, by the same killer. A killer who had access to both victims, who had opportunity and motive, and who was still at Greenways Manor. Inspector, Miss Marple said quietly. We need to return to the manor immediately, and we need to bring more constables. The situation there may be more dangerous than we realized. You know who did this. I believe I do, though I hope very much that I'm wrong. Miss Marple's expression was troubled. Because if I'm right, we're dealing with a peculiarly calculating sort of evil. The kind that plans carefully and shows no remorse. The kind that kills not in passion, but in cold, clear-headed pursuit of advantage. As they hurried back to Inspector Slack's motor car, Miss Marple found herself thinking of all the small signs she had observed throughout the evening. The handkerchief under Margaret's body, the unlocked bedroom door, the wet but intact evening slippers. Each detail had seemed insignificant at the time, but together they told a story of premeditation and ruthless efficiency. The snow had stopped falling, and the moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting a cold silver light over St. Mary Mead. In the distance, Greenways Manor rose against the night sky, its windows still blazing with light. Somewhere in that house, a killer waited. And Miss Jane Marple was about to prove what she had learned over 70 years of observation, that human nature, for all its infinite variety, followed certain patterns. And once you understood those patterns, you could predict and prevent the darkest of human impulses. But they would need to hurry, because if her suspicions were correct, the killer was not yet finished with their work. Chapter 7. The Watch at Midnight. They arrived at Greenways Manor, to find it in a state of controlled chaos. 2 more constables had arrived from the village, and the servants had been roused to provide tea and sandwiches for the marooned guests. Colonel Fortescue met them in the hall, his face haggard in the electric light. Thank God you're back. The strain of keeping everyone here, some of them are demanding to leave, threatening complaints to the chief constable. No one leaves, Inspector Slack said flatly. Miss Marple, perhaps you'd like to address the company. If you've worked out what's happened here, it might be best to bring everything into the open. Miss Marple paused, considering her natural preference was for discretion, for allowing people to maintain their dignity even in difficult circumstances. But 2 people had been struck down tonight, and 1 was dead. Discretion seemed a lesser consideration than justice. Very well, she said. But I should like everyone present, all the guests, and the servants too. What I have to say concerns the entire household. They gathered once more in the drawing room, which now bore little resemblance to the festive scene of earlier that evening. The Christmas tree stood dark, its candles unlit. The fire had burned down to embers. The guests arranged themselves like players in a tragedy, faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. Parsons, Mrs. Beale, and the other servants stood by the door, uncertain of their role in this drama. Miss Marple waited until everyone had settled, then rose from her chair, setting aside her knitting. I must apologize, she began, for what will seem like an old woman's presumption. I am not a detective, merely someone who has lived long enough to see certain patterns in human behavior. But I believe I understand what happened here tonight, and why, and I think it's time the truth was told. She looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze in turn. Adrian Fortescue, his polish entirely stripped away. Miss Winters, pale and trembling. George and Celia Prentice, clutching each other like shipwreck survivors. Dr. Pettigrew, hollow-eyed with grief. The Wentworths, the Clements, all wearing expressions of bewildered dread. Let me begin, Miss Marple said, with what happened at dinner. Margaret Fenwick made several provocative statements. She mentioned missing diamonds. She made a cryptic comment to Miss Winters about family connections. These weren't random observations. They were deliberate provocations, designed to make the killer reveal themselves through their reactions. But they didn't reveal themselves, George Prentice objected. Someone poisoned her before she could finish. Actually, Miss Marple said gently, someone poisoned her because she was getting close to the truth. You see, Margaret knew about the diamonds. She knew they were hidden somewhere in this house. And she knew that one person in particular would be desperate to keep that secret. Who? Colonel Fortescue demanded. But Miss Marple held up her hand. Patience, Colonel. We must proceed methodically. After Miss Fenwick collapsed, there was general confusion. Dr. Pettigrew examined her and pronounced her poisoned. An ambulance was called, the police notified. And in that confusion, while everyone's attention was on the victim, someone slipped away. Mrs. Pettigrew left her bedroom, Inspector Slack said. No, Miss Marple corrected softly. Mrs. Pettigrew was taken from her bedroom. Consider the facts. She was sedated, barely conscious according to her husband. Yet somehow she woke, unlocked the door from the inside, made her way downstairs and across the grounds to the summer house, all without being seen by anyone in this house. Dr. Pettigrew was shaking his head. She must have been less sedated than I thought. Doctor, you are a skilled physician. You know how much sedative to administer. If you say your wife should have been deeply unconscious, then she was, which means someone helped her from that room, someone who had a key to the bedroom door. I had the only key, Pettigrew protested. Did you? Miss Marple's gaze moved around the room. Or did someone else have access to it? The household keys are kept in the butler's pantry, are they not? Parsons. The butler nodded reluctantly. Yes, miss, but they're always locked away. Yet someone with legitimate access to that pantry could have taken an impression weeks ago, had a copy made in London, and returned it without anyone being the wiser. Miss Marple paused. Someone who had been planning this for quite some time. A heavy silence had fallen over the room. Everyone was watching Miss Marple now, following her logic toward an inevitable conclusion. Mrs. Pettigrew's death was made to look like an accident. Miss Marple continued. A confused, sedated woman wandering into the snow, but it was murder, carefully planned. The killer unlocked the bedroom door, roused Mrs. Pettigrew perhaps with promises of help or revelation, and led her to the summer house. Once there, Mrs. Pettigrew was rendered unconscious, a blow to the head perhaps, or more sedative forced upon her, and left to die of exposure while the killer returned to the house. But who? Celia Prentice cried out. Who would do such a thing? Miss Marple turned to face Dr. Richard Pettigrew. The husband, she said quietly. It's always instructive to ask, who benefits? Mrs. Pettigrew's death benefits one person above all others, the man who would inherit her estate, the man who stood to lose everything if her true parentage became known. Dr. Pettigrew had gone very white. That's insane. I loved Helen. I would never... You loved her until you discovered who she really was, Miss Marple said, and her voice held genuine sadness. You married Helen, believing she was an ordinary young woman, but then Dorothea Fortescue told her the truth, that she was the eldest grandchild, with a claim to a substantial inheritance. And Helen told you, didn't she? She confided in her husband, as wives do. She never... Please don't compound murder with lies, Dr. Pettigrew. Helen told you. And you realized that if her identity became known, if the diamonds were found and her claim validated, she would inherit a fortune that would be hers, not yours. Under English law, a wife's property remains her own. If inherited after marriage, you would have no automatic claim to it. Inspector Slack had moved closer to the doctor, one hand on his truncheon. Go on, Miss Marple. You decided to kill her, Miss Marple said, her tone remaining gentle despite the brutal words. But you needed it to look natural. You're a physician. You know how to administer drugs, how to make death appear accidental, but you also needed to ensure that any investigation would be confused by multiple incidents, hence the poisoning of Margaret Fenwick. I never touched Miss Fenwick's brandy. No, you didn't. Your wife did. The room erupted in exclamations. Miss Marple waited for silence before continuing. Helen Pettigrew administered the poison to Margaret Fenwick at your instruction. That's why her handkerchief was found under the body. She had knelt beside Margaret, either to place the poison in her glass before it was delivered, or to check that the poison had taken effect after Margaret collapsed. The brandy glass was poisoned before Parsons filled it. A few drops of belladonna tincture in the bottom of the glass which dissolved in the alcohol. But Helen became ill at dinner. Mrs. Clement objected. Before the poisoning, Helen was never ill. She feigned illness to provide an alibi to be upstairs, safely away from the scene when Margaret collapsed. Her husband sedated her with nothing more than water or a placebo, then locked the door to create the illusion that she couldn't have left the room. Miss Marple turned back to Dr. Pettigrew. Your plan was clever. Helen would be thought innocent. Having been upstairs throughout, Margaret would either die or be too ill to reveal what she knew. And Helen herself would die in what appeared to be a tragic accident, a sedated woman wandering into the snow. You would be the grieving widower, inheriting whatever property she had, and free from the complications of her true identity. You can't prove any of this, Pettigrew said, but his voice had lost conviction. Can't I? Inspector Slack's men have been searching the house while we were at the hospital. I suggested they pay particular attention to your medical bag. Slack pulled out a small brown bottle. Tincture of belladonna, found in Dr. Pettigrew's evening coat pocket. And there are traces of the same substance on a handkerchief, not Mrs. Pettigrew's embroidered one, but a plain man's handkerchief, used to wipe the glass clean before it was filled. It's a common medicine, Pettigrew protested desperately. Any doctor might carry it. True, Miss Marple agreed. But combined with the other evidence, your access to the keys, your opportunity to poison Miss Fenwick's glass earlier in the evening, while helping Parsons arrange the drinks tray, your intimate knowledge of your wife's movements. It paints a rather damning picture. What I don't understand, Miss Harriet Wentworth interjected, her scholarly precision engaged, is why Mrs. Pettigrew would agree to poison Miss Fenwick. If she stood to inherit through the diamonds, why participate in silencing the one person who was trying to help her? Because, Miss Marple said, Helen Pettigrew didn't know Margaret was trying to help. Her husband told her that Margaret was a threat, that Margaret had discovered her secret and was planning to expose her illegitimacy publicly, which would destroy her marriage and her place in society. He convinced Helen that they had to silence Margaret before she could reveal the truth, and Helen believed him, Inspector Slack said grimly. She trusted her husband completely. Fatally, Miss Marple agreed. She administered the poison thinking she was protecting her marriage, not realizing that her husband had already decided she was more valuable dead than alive. Once Margaret was dealt with, Helen herself became a liability, the only person who could connect him to the poisoning. So he killed her, making it appear that she had wandered into the snow in a sedated confusion. Dr. Pettigrew had slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. When he finally looked up, his expression was one of utter defeat. She wouldn't let it go, he whispered. Helen kept talking about the diamonds, about her grandmother, about claiming her inheritance. She didn't understand what it would mean, the scandal, the investigations, the revelation that she'd married me under false pretenses. I would have been ruined. My practice, my reputation, everything. So you decided to kill her, Slack said flatly. I decided to protect us both. If Margaret died and the secret died with her, we could have continued as we were. But Helen, his voice broke. Helen was so naive. She left her handkerchief at the scene. She might have said something, might have revealed what we'd done. I couldn't risk it. So you murdered your wife, Miss Marple said quietly. You led her to the summer house with promises perhaps of hiding evidence or discussing strategy, and there you administered a fatal dose of morphine, quick, relatively painless, and easily mistaken for the effects of cold and sedation once the body was discovered. Then you returned to the house, made sure you were seen in the drawing room, and waited for someone to discover her body. Dr. Pettigrew said nothing. His silence was confirmation enough. Inspector Slack nodded to his constables. Dr. Richard Pettigrew, I'm arresting you for the murders of Helen Pettigrew and the attempted murder of Margaret Fenwick. You'll be taken into custody and formally charged. Anything you say may be used in evidence. As the constables led him away, Pettigrew looked back at the assembled company with something like bewilderment. I'm a doctor, he said. I took an oath to do no harm. How did it come to this? You put your own interests above your duty, Miss Marple said gently. That's how it always begins. And it always ends the same way, with tragedy and regret. After Pettigrew was removed, the room remained silent for a long moment. Then Colonel Fortescue cleared his throat. The diamonds, he said hoarsely. Margaret said they were still in the house. If Helen had a legitimate claim, the diamonds are indeed still here, Miss Marple confirmed. Margaret discovered where Dorothea had hidden them, and tomorrow in daylight I believe we can retrieve them, but that is a matter for her heir, whoever that may be, and for the courts to determine. Tonight has seen quite enough drama. One by one, the guests began to depart. most to be driven home by constables given the late hour and the shock they had suffered. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, Miss Winters approached her, her face still pale, but her expression determined. "Miss Marple, about Helen Pettigrew. She was the true granddaughter, not me. But Margaret told me I had a connection to the family." "What did she mean?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "That, my dear, is a conversation for another day. But I suspect that if you examine your family history carefully, you'll find you have more claim to the Fortescue name than you realized. Perhaps not through direct descent, but through connection and affection. Sometimes that matters more than mere blood." As Fred drove her back through the snowy village streets, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's events. 2 dead, or nearly so, 1 arrested, and a family torn apart by secrets and greed. It was not the Christmas gathering anyone had anticipated, but justice had been served. The pattern had been recognized, the truth revealed, and that, Miss Marple thought, was something to be grateful for, even on this dark Christmas morning. The clock on St. Mary Mead Church struck 1 as she arrived home. Christmas Day had begun, though few would celebrate it with joy in the wake of what had transpired at Greenways Manor. But life would continue, as it always did. The village would recover, the scandal would eventually fade, and people would remember this Christmas for years to come, not for its festivity, but for the terrible lesson it taught, about the consequences of placing wealth and reputation above love and honesty. Miss Marple prepared for bed with her usual careful routine, then knelt beside it for her nightly prayers. She prayed for Margaret Fenwick's recovery, for Helen Pettigrew's soul, and yes, even for Dr. Richard Pettigrew, who had lost everything through his own moral weakness. And she prayed that she would never become so jaded by her observations of human nature, that she lost her capacity for hope. Hope that people could be better, that love could triumph over fear, and that Christmas, for all its complications, could still represent the possibility of redemption and renewal. Chapter 8. The Gift of Understanding. Boxing Day dawned clear and cold, the snow lying pristine across St. Mary Mead, except where paths had been cleared by industrious villagers. Miss Marple rose early, dressed warmly, and received an expected telephone call from Inspector Slack at 9:30. "Miss Marple, hospital reports that Margaret Fenwick is conscious and asking for you again. She's not strong, but the doctor thinks she'll recover. Thought you'd want to know." "Thank you, Inspector. I shall visit this afternoon, and the other matter we discussed. All arranged. Colonel Fortescue and his solicitor will meet you at Greenways at 2 o'clock. Miss Winters has been notified as well." Miss Marple spent the morning at church. Christmas services had been postponed due to the previous night's drama, but the vicar was offering a special service of reflection and healing. The church was surprisingly full, the congregation drawn together by shared shock and the need for communal comfort. After a simple lunch, she made her way once more to Greenways Manor, this time in proper daylight. The house looked different in the winter sun, less mysterious, more substantial, a place where both tragedies and ordinary life had unfolded for generations. Colonel Fortescue met her in the hall, looking older than he had 2 days ago. "Miss Marple, I confess I'm still reeling from all of this. That poor young woman, Helen Pettigrew, murdered by her own husband, and to think she was my wife's granddaughter all along. These are difficult revelations," Miss Marple agreed. "But perhaps some good can come from the tragedy. Miss Fenwick told me yesterday where your late wife hid the diamonds. She discovered it through persistence, and I suspect a better understanding of Mrs. Fortescue's character than anyone else possessed." They proceeded to the library, where Adrian Fortescue, Miss Winters, George and Celia Prentice, and Mr. Grayson the solicitor waited. Everyone looked tired and subdued, the festive spirit entirely extinguished. "Now then," Colonel Fortescue said heavily, "Miss Marple has agreed to show us where Dorothea hid the diamonds. After that, Mr. Grayson will advise us on the legal situation." Miss Marple moved to the bookshelves that lined one wall. "Your late wife was fond of poetry, was she not, Colonel?" "Very fond. She could recite great swaths of it from memory." "And her favourite poet?" "Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She had a first edition of the sonnets from the Portuguese treasuret, kept it in a locked case." Miss Marple's fingers traced along the shelf until they found a slim volume in a protective case. "Margaret Fenwick remembered that your wife often quoted Sonnet 43, 'How do I love thee? Let me count the ways.' She realized that this favorite poem might have special significance. She opened the case and removed the book carefully. As she did so, she tipped it at an angle, and something slid from between the pages, a small leather pouch tied with silk cord. The room was absolutely silent. as Miss Marple loosened the cord and poured the contents onto the library table. Diamonds caught the winter light, scattering it in brilliant points across the wood. A necklace, bracelet, earrings and brooch, just as described. Old-fashioned settings, heavy Victorian gold, but the stones themselves magnificent. "Dear God," Colonel Fortescue whispered. "They were here all along." "Your wife hid them where she thought they'd be safe," Miss Marple said. "In her most precious book, waiting to be passed to her granddaughter. She died before she could complete that transfer, and the secret died with her, except for Margaret Fenwick, who knew Mrs. Fortescue well enough to guess where she might hide something valuable." Mr. Grayson had put on spectacles, and was examining the diamonds with professional interest. "These are quite valuable, perhaps £20,000, possibly more. The question is, to whom do they belong?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is complex. They were Dorothea Fortescue's property, left ambiguous in her will. She clearly intended them for Helen Pettigrew, but never formalized that intention. Helen is now deceased, murdered by her husband. Under normal circumstances, Dr. Pettigrew would inherit as her widower. Surely he can't profit from his crime." Celia Prentice exclaimed. "No, he cannot. English law prevents a murderer from inheriting from his victim, which means Helen's estate, including any claim she might have had on these diamonds, passes according to intestacy rules. She had no children, no siblings. It would revert to her birth mother's family. Her grandmother was my wife," Colonel Fortescue said slowly. "So they would come to me, or to Mrs. Fortescue's other descendants," Mr. Grayson said carefully, "which would include Mrs. Prentice and Mr. Adrian Fortescue as her acknowledged grandchildren." There was an awkward silence. Then Miss Winters spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I believe I can resolve this, at least partially. Miss Fenwick told me something before she was poisoned. She said she'd discovered that my mother, whom I'd always believed to be unrelated to this family, was actually a distant cousin of Dorothea Fortescue, not close enough to contest the estate, but close enough to explain why Dorothea took an interest in me when I arrived in St. Mary Mead as Adrian's secretary." Adrian Fortescue looked startled. "You mean Uncle's invitation to bring you here wasn't coincidence?" "I think," Miss Marple interjected gently, "that Colonel Fortescue had been in correspondence with Margaret Fenwick before he invited her for Christmas. I think he knew, or at least suspected, that Miss Winters had some connection to the family. The reconciliation dinner was partly genuine, and partly an attempt to bring all the interested parties together and resolve the matter of the diamonds once and for all." The Colonel's expression confirmed this. "Margaret wrote to me 6 months ago. She'd softened, she said, wanted to make peace. She also mentioned that she'd discovered the diamonds' location and wanted to ensure they went to the rightful heir. We'd been planning this gathering for months. But then Dr. Pettigrew complicated everything," Miss Marple said. "He discovered what his wife stood to inherit, decided to seize it for himself, and set in motion a plan to eliminate both Helen and the one person who could prove her claim, Margaret Fenwick." "So what happens now?" George Prentice asked practically. "Who gets the diamonds?" Mr. Grayson cleared his throat. "That will require legal proceedings to determine properly. However, I would suggest that the family might wish to come to an arrangement among themselves. The diamonds could be sold and the proceeds divided, or they could be retained as a family heirloom with some financial settlement to those who don't receive the physical jewelry. I think," Celia Prentice said slowly, "that they should go to Miss Winters. Helen Pettigrew was our cousin, and she's dead because of these wretched things. But Miss Winters is alive, and she's family too, even if distantly. It seems right." Adrian nodded. "I agree. Uncle, the estate is yours. I have my business in London. Celia has her marriage settlement. Miss Winters has nothing but a secretary's salary. The diamonds should be hers." Colonel Fortescue looked at the jewelry glittering on the table, then at Miss Winters's shocked face. "Is that what you want, my dear? To take them?" Miss Winters seemed unable to speak. Finally she said, "I don't want them for their value, but if they could be sold, and the money used to establish a trust, perhaps for women in situations like my grandmother's first daughter, unmarried mothers who need support, that would feel right to me, like something good coming from all this tragedy." "A charitable trust," Mr. Grayson said approvingly. "That could be arranged quite easily, and it would honor Mrs. Fortescue's memory appropriately." As the family discussion continued, Miss Marple quietly withdrew to the window. She had done what she needed to do, revealed the truth, recovered the diamonds, and seen justice served at least partially. The rest was for the family to decide. Later that afternoon she visited Margaret Fenwick at the hospital. The woman was still weak but lucid, and she smiled when Miss Marple entered. "I hear they found the diamonds where I said they'd be." "In the Browning," Miss Marple confirmed. "You knew Dorothea Fortescue very well." "I loved her," Margaret said simply. "She was my aunt, but she was also my friend. When she died, I was devastated, and when I realized the diamonds had disappeared, I became obsessed with finding them, not for their value but because they represented her last wishes, her desire to make amends to the granddaughter she'd been forced to abandon. You fought for Helen Pettigrew without her knowledge. She was terrified of exposure, but she deserved her inheritance." Margaret's expression darkened. "I never imagined her own husband would kill her for it." "Greed makes people capable of terrible things," Miss Marple said. "But the family has decided to honor Helen's memory. The diamonds will fund a charitable trust in Dorothea Fortescue's name, helping women in difficult situations." "She would have liked that," Margaret said softly. "Dorothea always had compassion for those society condemned." She looked at Miss Marple curiously. "How did you know about Pettigrew? I mean, when did you realize?" "Several small things," Miss Marple admitted. "The handkerchief was important. It suggested Mrs. Pettigrew had been near the body, but why would she check on Miss Fenwick unless she knew what had happened? Then there was the doctor's behavior. He seemed distraught about his wife's disappearance, but he hadn't actually searched for her himself until we suggested it. He'd locked her in, he said, yet the key was on the inside. Small contradictions that added up to a pattern. And the pattern told you he was a murderer. The pattern told me he was afraid of something. The murder became clear only when I understood what he had to lose, his wife's potential inheritance, which would have been legally hers, not his." Miss Marple paused. "I've seen similar cases in St. Mary Mead. The husband who pushed his wife down the stairs when she inherited money from her father. The young man who poisoned his fiancée when he discovered her fortune came with conditions he couldn't accept. Human nature repeats itself. Miss Fenwick, once you've seen the patterns, you recognize them when they appear again." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Will you visit me again, Miss Marple? I find I have very few friends left, and I'd like to talk to someone who understands." "I would be delighted," Miss Marple said warmly. "And when you're recovered, you must come to tea. I believe you and Dolly Bantry would get along splendidly. She loves a good mystery, and you've certainly provided one." As Miss Marple made her way home through the late afternoon light, she reflected on the strange Christmas gathering that had ended in death and revelation. The snow was beginning to melt in places, revealing the brown earth beneath. Soon spring would come, and with it the renewal that always followed winter's harshness. She thought of Helen Pettigrew, dead at her husband's hands, of Dr. Richard Pettigrew, facing trial for murder, of Margaret Fenwick, recovering in hospital after nearly being poisoned, of the Fortescue family, trying to make sense of secrets that had lain hidden for decades. And she thought, as she often did, about the essential mystery of human nature, how people could be simultaneously capable of great love and terrible cruelty, of sacrifice and selfishness, of wisdom and willful blindness. Her cottage welcomed her with its familiar warmth. She prepared tea, settled in her favorite chair, and took up her knitting once more. The christening shawl was nearly complete, just a few more rows, and it would be finished. As her needles clicked in the quiet room, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Another mystery solved. Another pattern recognized. Another lesson learned about the complexity of human hearts. And tomorrow, Christmas services would finally be held, and St. Mary Mead would begin to heal from the shock of the 12 suspects of Christmas. Though in the end, there had been only one true suspect, revealed through observation, patience, and an old woman's deep understanding of how people truly were, beneath all their social masks and careful pretenses. The clock struck 5. Outside, the church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to evening prayer. Miss Marple set down her knitting, rose from her chair, and prepared to join them. Because even after murder and betrayal, even after death and revelation, life continued. The village endured, and there was always the possibility of redemption, if people were brave enough to face the truth and wise enough to learn from it. That, Miss Marple reflected as she donned her coat and hat, was perhaps the greatest mystery of all, not why people did terrible things, but why, despite everything, hope persisted. And so she walked through the snow-dusted streets to church, leaving behind her the warmth of her cottage, and carrying with her the quiet certainty that came from understanding of human nature, of justice, and of the strange, persistent resilience of the human spirit. The end.